This is Office Hours at Duke University. We're talking today with Professor Robert Cook-Deegan. Our topic is the bombshell that exploded this week at the intersection of science, law, and public policy. Bombshell is the word Professor Cook-Deegan used with Science magazine to describe the historic decision about patenting human genes that a federal court handed down on Monday. We invite you to send a question to Professor Cook-Deegan. To do that, email live@duke.edu, post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page, or tweet with the tag Duke Live. I'm David Jarmel, the head of Duke's Office of News and Communications, and Professor Cook-Deegan, thanks for joining us for your online office hours.
Thank you.
Let me tell everyone a few things about you. You have worked on issues involving science policy for several prominent scientific organizations in Washington and at the U.S. Congress. Here at Duke, you are the director of the Center for Genome Ethics, Law, and Policy, which is part of the Institute for Genome Sciences and Policy. You are a physician, a human rights activist, and the author of The Gene Wars, Science, Politics, and the Human Genome, and full disclosure, you and I worked together occasionally when we were both at the National Academy of Sciences several years ago. So let's talk about this bombshell and what it means for medical research, for our economy, and most important, for anyone who has genes and may get sick, which means all of us. The judge handed down a decision in this case on Monday involving the patenting of human genes. Tell us what the judge decided and what the case might mean.
Sure, David, thank you. And ironically, as you know, this case we didn't know this was going to happen when we scheduled this session, so it's really timely that this decision came down on Monday.
We have the gene for foresight.
Yeah, that's right. So let me set the stage by explaining a little bit about this particular case, and then maybe later in the interview we can go into the broader implications.
Great.
But basically, on Monday morning, everybody thought gene patents were out there, and they were just a matter of course. There are a lot of them, in the United States in particular. And by Monday afternoon, the media were in a frenzy with this decision that Judge Robert Sweet in Federal District Court in Manhattan, in New York, put down on Monday. And basically he said that DNA is a special molecule that cannot be patented. And the context in which he made that decision is probably the single most controversial set of gene patents that there have ever been. These are patents that cover two genes that when they are changed in somebody's body, when they're mutated or changed in somebody's body, they increase the risk of developing breast or ovarian cancer. So our company, Myriad Genetics, has these patents. They have the rights to these patents, and they have, since 1998, been the only provider of genetic testing for these two genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, in the United States. So as of Monday, Judge Sweet has said for most of the key claims in the patents on these two genes that they are no longer valid, which means that Myriad Genetics cannot sue anybody for making, using, selling, or doing anything else with these genes.
Which means I can go into business and start testing for those.
You could, although you'd be taking a pretty big risk right now,
right?
Because we don't know where this case is finally going to end up.
Right, but it sounds like the judge is saying last week it was legal to patent genes, and this week now it's not.
Pretty much, that's right, and that's why it was a bombshell.
Okay. Well, let's go right to a question that we received from Twitter. From Misha, who says, could the Myriad ruling have far-reaching effects beyond this particular company and set of facts?
So one thing that everybody should understand is this is the first step in what is almost certainly going to be a really long dance. And this is a surprising first step, but for right now, the main people who are affected by this are the company itself, and the women who were the parties to this case, and then the health professional organizations that were also among those who brought suit against the company. A decision at the district court level basically only says anything about this particular case. But the arguments that this judge has made are about whether DNA can be patented at all if this ruling is upheld at the next higher level of the federal court system, then it would have a pretty big impact. But we don't know how broad that impact is going to be until that next court above this judge
Right.
makes its decision.
And
That'll
to
be
provide a
year.
scale, my understanding is that there are already more than 4,000 patents on different human genes, which is something like 20% of the human genome. So we're talking about a big number here.
So yeah, and you'd think that we would know how many genes are patented. You'd think that, you know, somebody must be watching. In fact, none of us knows. And there's nobody on the planet who knows how many gene patents there are. There are more in the United States than there are in other parts of the world. There aren't all that many that have ever found their way into court like this one finally has. But there are a lot of business decisions that have been made premised on expectations that there will be patent rights to be had.
Right.
So this could be a big deal or it could not be a big deal, and it depends on what's going to happen at the Court of Appeals level. And frankly, I think this is the kind of case that might be accepted by the Supreme Court.
Right. So it's obviously a big deal to scientists and to the companies involved and to researchers that are placed here like Duke and other universities. But what does it mean to me if I'm a patient and I'm worried that I might have cancer or, for that matter, some other disease? Why does this matter to me?
So this is one of the most interesting things about this case that makes it different. I've said that there were all sorts of gene patents. In fact, there have been gene patent cases that have gone through the court system and they've been upheld. So up until now, everybody's just kind of taken it as a matter of course that you can get gene patents. And that's not just the United States. That's the United States, Europe, Japan, all over the world. There have been gene patents. The interesting thing about this case is that this is the first time the patenting of a gene has been brought up in the context of diagnosis. So that's interesting in two respects. One, the people who sued this company are not other companies. This is the way the patent law usually works, right? Is Microsoft sues another software company or Intel sues AMD. But that's not the situation here. The people who sued Myriad Genetics were their natural customers. They were health professional organizations that run labs, and they were women who wanted to get their breast cancer test, but because of the policies of this company, they're saying you can't get your test anyplace else other than from us.
Right, and it's like $3,000.
The most common, if you're in a family that might be at risk and you're the first person to go to the company, the test is to sequence all of the DNA in these two genes and look for spelling differences.
Right.
And that test costs $3,120 if you pay for it out of pocket.
Right. On the other hand, we live in a country where we have a capitalist system, and biotechnology is one of the hot industries of the future. Here in North Carolina, we've had big declines in things like textiles and furniture
Right.
and other traditional industries and so forth around the country. We want a strong biotech system. Don't places like Myriad, companies like that, don't they need patents to do their jobs?
So, in fact, I think they probably do need patents. The question that's going to be in front of the system now is, do they need this kind of patent? And if you think about it, these patents do support a certain business model. It's the one that Myriad Genetics pursued, which is we own the rights to test for this gene and nobody else can do that. And that's going to be our business. That's how we're going to make our money. If you think about it, though, the claims that they got on these patents basically block anybody else from testing for that gene. So let's say, what's going on in the technology now? Well, the technologies now are moving in the direction of testing for thousands or millions or even your entire genome. So probably within 3 or 4 years, you're going to be able to get your entire genome sequenced for more or less the same cost as their test for these two genes.
Right.
So, but can you do that legally? Well, no. You would be infringing the claims of several of these patents if you sequenced my entire genome and told me the results of this particular gene. The way these claims were written, and that's what the courts have to contend with, these claims are infringed, which means there would be a shadow of liability for patent infringement over the companies that would give me the information about my own genome. And I think that's where this judge has perceived, oh, this is a different way of using gene patents than when you use DNA to make a protein that you're going to put in somebody's body, where it's more obvious that that's a human invention.
Right. We're getting some great questions, and we want to remind everyone who's watching that we invite you to send your question into Professor Cook-Deegan as well. To do that, email live@duke.edu, post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page, or tweet with the tag Duke Live. So let me ask a question that has come in on Twitter from R. Clayson. I hope I'm saying the name correctly. And the question is, who are the winners and losers in the gene patent ruling from this past Monday?
You know, it's going to be hard to know who the winners and losers are until it settles out. But for right now, who's cheering and booing? It's easier to answer that question. The cheers are coming from the scientific community that has always been rather suspicious of gene patents. A lot of scientists are not hostile to patents in general, but they are quite concerned about the implications of having patents on genes. And the reason for that is because DNA really is a special molecule. It's valuable mainly because of the information that it contains. And these patents basically are effectively claiming any way of getting that information out of people's bodies. So a lot of scientists have been uncomfortable with that. A lot of disease advocates have been uncomfortable with that. So those groups are cheering this decision. Some of the emails I've gotten have basically said, oh, finally a judge who understands some biology. On the other hand, the big loser here, of course, is Myriad Genetics, whose business plan is premised on having exclusive rights to this gene. This is how they make the most money in their whole company, is this particular test. So suddenly that's at risk.
Right, but other companies as well, as we think about the broader
So other
implications.
companies that have that same business model, yes. The thing to notice, and this is where I think the business press is beginning to go even this week. If you read the business press last week or the week before, when they were thinking about gene patents and cases like this, it was apocalyptic rhetoric that the whole biotech industry is going to fall apart if this decision goes the way it went. By Tuesday, many of the companies are saying, well, you know, maybe that's not so much the case because this is only one kind of patent. And the kinds of patents that we depend on in our business, if we're in a different line of business, really don't depend very much on these particular gene patents. Moreover, if you think about it, if you're in the business of developing one of these genetic tests that's going to be scanning the entire genome or doing full genome sequence analysis, this has just opened the gate. It says, oh, I don't have to worry about getting sued for sequencing across the BRCA1 or BRCA2 region of the genome. They can't sue me now, so maybe I can go out and raise some capital so I can develop those new technologies and go into that line of business. So at the same time as you close the gate on one way of doing business, they've opened the gate for all sorts of alternative ways of doing business. And I actually think those new ways of doing genomic analysis are higher growth and more likely to be what the future looks like than this past model.
Right, so let's back up a bit. And how reliable are these tests? We're talking here about tests for breast cancer, but there are other kinds of tests out there. You can increasingly look in magazines and on the web, and there are companies that are offering to do your personal genome. You referred to that a moment ago. How reliable is it? Most of this is not regulated by the FDA and others.
That's right. So how reliable are the tests? Two ways to answer that question. Are these tests really good at figuring out what the DNA sequence is and accurately reporting that back to somebody? They're really, really good at that. How good are these tests at reading that information and then interpreting it for you to tell you what does it mean for you in your life? That's highly variable. This gene, ironically, is probably one of the most studied genes on the planet.
Right.
And it's about as reliable information as we can get. And even here, what you get back, if you're in one of these families, in one of the very high-risk families, let me be clear here, these tests for breast cancer risk are really only relevant for families where there are multiple cases and it's very clear that it's inherited risk. That's really a small fraction of women at risk of breast cancer. So it's only multiple cases, early onset. So it's not a genetic test for all of breast cancer, only for those families. But within those families, it really is a big deal.
Yeah.
And what you get back is an answer that you're at 70 or 80% risk of breast cancer during your lifetime
Right.
if you test positive. And if you test negative, then you're at normal risk. And you may be at 40% risk of ovarian cancer. But the point is, you're still at 20% odds of having a completely breast cancer-free life.
Right.
Or a 60% chance of having
And expanding
ovarian
that
cancer.
even beyond breast cancer to other areas where, with obesity or heart disease, where already people are told by their doctors to eat a certain way, to not smoke, and millions of people disregard it even without the genetic information. So,
Right,
how do we know that having this new kind of genetic information is at the end of the day actually going to change what people do?
Well, I don't think we do know whether it's going to do that. And this breast cancer testing is at one far end of the spectrum where the genetic information is pretty well studied. We kind of know how to interpret it. Although one little interesting thing about this is almost all of the studies that have been done on this kind of breast cancer testing have been done in families that have multiple cases. So even right now in 2010, we really don't know if you have a spelling change in either one of these two genes, but nobody else in your family has ever gotten breast cancer for one reason or another.
Right.
We actually don't know what the overall risk in the general population is because we haven't been able to study that until just about now.
Right. Right.
So our figures of risk may actually seem much higher than they actually are, even when you have one of these breast cancer mutations. So that's at one extreme. And then most of the tests that we're doing for genetic variation in human beings, your odds of getting diabetes may go up by 20% or down by 20%. And does that mean anything? We don't know.
Right.
These technologies have been out there for 2 or 3 years. People are beginning to get this kind of information and they process it in different ways.
Right.
And frankly, we don't know what they're going to do with the information.
And we'll have to learn more about that. Let me just say we have about 50 viewers who are on with us now, and we invite you to send in your question to Professor Cook-Deegan. There are 3 ways you can do that. You can email live@duke.edu, post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page, or tweet with the tag Duke Live. And in fact, let's go to an email question from Catherine, and she asked this question. Might this affect other types of patents involving DNA? For instance, patents upon research methodologies involving DNA. I am thinking all the way back to that original patent at Stanford in 1975 regarding recombinant DNA technology.
It's possible that following the logic of Judge Sweet, that many gene patents would be overturned. And the judge did a really, really nice job of taking these patents, which are really, really incredibly abstruse documents, and he interpreted the claims. The claims are the language in these documents that basically say, here's my fence. This is my territory, and I'm marking it with these claims, so you can't walk into my space without paying me money or getting my permission. So he's taken those claims and he's put them into 2 categories. Category 1 is a claim basically on the DNA itself. And the other kind of claim is basically a way of doing things, a method claim. So to give you an example, he's saying some of the claims in here are the DNA from this gene. And another set of claims is, so you take somebody's sample and you compare it to the reference sequence that we have in databases, and you look for differences in the sequence, and then you tell people what their risk of breast cancer is. So they do have claims of both kinds.
Right.
That method claim is already vulnerable, and he's saying, that not fair, way too broad, you don't get those claims. And that reasoning is likely to be upheld, I think, at the next higher level. The most controversial part of this ruling was his declaration that on these claims for the DNA itself, he's saying no fair. You don't get to patent DNA because by patenting DNA, you are in effect patenting the information. It's an embodiment of information
Right.
that we don't have the right to say that's the sort of thing.
Right, I
you
mean,
can
people
patent.
would say that it wasn't that scientist who created that. It was evolution, or if you prefer, it was God, depending how
That's
you
right.
view it. And so it is not the place of the patent system to be locking that up.
Right.
Is that essentially what the judge is saying?
Yeah, that's right. But back to the question about the relevance back to those early patents, the Cohen-Boyer patents that Stanford and the University of California got. That would not be vulnerable. Incidentally, that patent expired in 1997.
Right.
So it's in the public domain anyway. But even if it came up now, that method was actually for an invention that would almost certainly meet the definition, because it was the hand of man that created the technology
And
for
that's a
snipping
legal
out
phrase,
DNA
right?
and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think it would still survive. What will not survive under the logic of Judge Sweet's opinion is claims to DNA itself as a molecule.
Right. Now, in terms of how this will affect medical researchers at Duke and around the world, I can think back to some time ago when some of the early gene hunters, including people who've become fairly prominent since then, I think of Francis Collins, who
Right.
made his reputation in part by finding the gene defect involved in cystic fibrosis and in other diseases. And many of those early discoveries were for single gene defects. In other words, a single gene
Right.
that would then cause you to get cystic fibrosis or some other very bad disease. Increasingly, though, we have researchers looking at things like heart disease and cancer that involve many genes and many pathways interacting in all kinds of ways. It would seem to me that if I was a researcher and I had to go to Myriad for this gene and to another company for that gene and another company for that gene, I might just throw up my hands and say, life's too short. I'm going to go study something else. Is that what's happening now?
That has been a very serious concern for a really long time, that there would be so many patents on so many little pieces of the human genome that if you actually wanted to do anything scientifically, you'd have to get permission from everybody. And instead of running centrifuges, you'd be running a lawyer's office to send out letters saying, "Mother, may I?" Right?
Yeah.
So that has been a concern. Now, Wes Cohen here at our business school and some of his colleagues, John Walsh at Georgia Tech, did a really nice survey for the National Academies. And they asked scientists, do you even pay attention to this stuff? And lo and behold, it's pretty clear. Scientists, for the most part, completely ignore whether there are patent rights on the genes that they're studying. And is that okay? Yeah, for the most part, that's okay. Is it legally wrong? Well, they are infringing the patents.
Isn't that a signal, though, that there's something wrong with the system if everyone has to sort of knowingly wink at it?
You know what? Lawyers disagree about whether that's okay or not.
Yeah.
But that is the situation. So let's take this case of BRCA. There are about 7,000. I did a quick search on the web for how many papers have been published that say something about BRCA. And there are about 7,000 papers. So the Myriad folks are saying, look, we haven't sued anybody. There's lots of research going on. So the patents don't get in the way of research. They don't matter. On the other hand, if you look at what they've claimed in their patents, almost all of the research in those 7,000 papers that was done in the United States would have infringed those patents. Now, is that good news or is that bad news? It does mean that at least under current U.S. law, there's massive infringement going on of our patent system. Is that okay? I don't know.
Yeah. It feels like this is a situation in flux, and the judge is, in this particular case, is helping to move that along.
Yeah.
You said at the beginning that almost everyone expects this will be appealed. So actually, we have a great question that we got by email from Eric, and Eric asks, what changes would you suggest for the patent system to basically to help get us out of this mess? So Bob, if you were the appeals judge and you had the power, how would you rule, just briefly?
You know, if I were at this next higher court, and I'll just be arrogant and sit there for a minute, right? I would be looking for a way.
Probably can't wear the flower shirt.
No, I'd have to dress somewhat differently, I guess, have my big black robe. I would be looking for a way that would allow me to preserve the incentive system of the patents for using DNA when it's a way to produce a valuable protein, or when the DNA is itself can be a vaccine or something you're going to use to treat somebody with a disease. And I'd want to say, yeah, the patent system's doing some good over there, but you know what? This makes no sense when you can use patents to block people from getting information about the world or about the DNA that's in my body or your body. And I'd be looking for a way to come up with a legal doctrine that says this kind of gene patent okay, that kind of gene patent not okay, and that would look like probably a set of legal interpretive doctrines that create zones. The problem right now is we've got one flavor for everything, and there aren't any legal doctrines on this, how DNA is different because it contains information rather than just having a molecular structure. And that's what I'd be looking for a way to make that distinction between good uses of patents, bad uses of patents, and how you can structure these claims. So I'd be reining in these very broad claims and saying, no, 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 that's not fair. But you know what? I do like gene patents when you use it to make insulin or you use it to make growth hormone.
How did we end up here? I mean, how is it that we're talking about a legal situation that has become obviously fairly convoluted and depending on your perspective, problematic in one direction or the other, with an industry that's so important, not only financially, but to so many people's lives, especially in the future? How did we get here, briefly?
Because we're America. We got here because by dint of history, these technologies have, molecular biology really didn't get hot really until the 1970s, right? Recombinant DNA, DNA sequencing were all things that happened in the 1970s. The patent system was becoming really important. Biotechnology got hot in the 1980s. This was beautiful, elegant science that was becoming very practically relevant. And it grew up at precisely the time that universities were given an open invitation by the federal government to get into the patenting game.
Right.
And Congress made that conscious decision because they said, you know what, we want these universities working closely with industry. We think biotechnology is going to be a growth sector of our economy. We want those jobs. Those are high-paying, good jobs. And you know, a lot of that is, that's true. It's absolutely true that that is what happened. We have companies like Amgen and Genentech that have made a ton of money in this area. And those two companies in particular did that through gene patents on
Right.
these valuable proteins.
Right.
So that worked. And that's why the courts were right? Look, you give these people patents, they go out, they make money, they create jobs, and the Bay Area is all the richer for it, right?
Right, and not just the Bay Area. I mean, here in parts of North Carolina.
Yeah,
and elsewhere
so,
around
and
the
that
country.
model spreads through,
Exactly.
not only throughout the United States,
But more
but
than them making
throughout the
profits,
world.
have people's lives been saved?
That's a little bit harder to tell for some of these. So the poster child I used to use for gene patents was the drug erythropoietin, which stimulates the production of red blood cells. So it was originally used for kidney disease. It's now used for cancer therapy and,
Right.
and in many other contexts. And the theory behind the use of erythropoietin is just wonderful. It's obvious that, of course, if somebody doesn't have enough red blood cells, you should stimulate their production. It turns out, however, that it's not crystal clear that it has saved a whole lot of lives. The clinical studies that are beginning to come out now suggest we may be overusing it, and people may be harmed by the overuse as much as they're being benefited by the initial use.
Right.
So it's turning out to be a little bit murkier picture than we thought it was for that drug.
Right. I want to ask you a question about sort of more generally about how our country is commercializing this. But first, I just want to remind our viewers that we invite them to send in a question as well to Professor Cook-Deegan. They can do that in three ways. They can email live@duke.edu, post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page, or tweet with the tag Duke Live. And I do have to tell you that we received one tweet from someone called Genome Genevieve, and she loves your shirt. So let's go to the broader question about commercialization. So you actually went to work in Congress in the late and lamented Office of Technology Assessment, I guess a few years after the historic 1980 Bayh-Dole Act, which, as a reminder, was passed by the Congress as a way to commercialize the research for which our government spends billions of dollars. The taxpayers through the NIH and other agencies are spending a lot of money to carry out this research. And there was a feeling then, and there's sometimes a feeling now, that we do a great job coming up with discoveries, maybe not such a great job out of producing businesses and jobs here in the United States. And that act was passed as a way to encourage people to get patents and to commercialize the fruits of the research coming out of all the great work being done at labs around the country. Beyond the specific question of gene patenting, put on your science policy hat, how are we doing as a country in terms of how we commercialize the great scientific research that takes place in the United States?
The U.S. is generally considered pretty much the model of how to do it. But I have to tell you, it's a really complicated story, and I'm not going to go into all because everybody's going to fall asleep if I get.
Well, we have
I'll go into
150
class
viewers on now, so let's try to keep them.
But let me just make one historical analogy here. Think about 1980. It's an amazing year. All this stuff happened in 1980 because in June of that year, the Supreme Court comes down with a totally bombshell ruling, just as surprising as the one that happened on Monday, that says, you know what, you can patent a living thing. That was a 5-4 decision. So one justice voting the other way flips it the other way. That was the Diamond v. Chakravarti decision. And as soon as the Supreme Court had made that decision, the Patent Office went back to a whole bunch of patents that they were looking at, including this one that was mentioned earlier from Stanford and the University of California for recombinant DNA technology. They said, whoop, okay, you can patent genes. You can patent methods that are related to molecular biology, like that one. So those two events both happened. Those are legal events in 1980. Genentech goes public and sets a new record for capitalization on the first day of a newly marketed firm. So biotech that day was huge in the history of biotechnology.
Right.
And that was premised on this technology of recombinant DNA that came out of University of California and Stanford. But so that's, wow, we're doing it right? So we got all these companies making lots of money. The universities are doing good stuff. They're licensing it out. But notice something about that patent. That patent was openly prosecuted, and they didn't exclusively license it to Genentech. Genentech wanted them to. It was just a baby startup at that point.
Yeah.
But Stanford and the University of California said, no, boy, if we give this to just one company, they can't possibly exploit this technology to its fullest extent.
Right.
So we're going to license it to everybody, and we're going to charge them a little bit of their royalties on any drugs they make. That way they made $255 million for those two universities, and nobody was blocked from getting access to the technology.
Yeah.
Brilliant. But that's different from getting a gene patent and saying, oh, we're going to be the only group in the United States that gets to test for this gene.
Right.
So one of the things to notice here is it may not be the case that we're focusing on patents as being the problem. It is the case that sometimes patents are part of the problem, but the real problem is how you use them and how you license them from your university.
Right.
And that's a system that is a learning system, but it's a learning system that doesn't have a brain. So let me explain what I mean by that.
All right.
So the Bayh-Dole statute did two wonderful things. It said, we know now what the rules are going to be. So each university doesn't have to negotiate one agency at a time, right? So recombinant DNA was done with both money from the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health.
Right.
In those days, you would have to go to each agency and say, oh, do we get to patent it? Don't we? It takes a lot of time, costs a lot of money, find out. So they passed this law that says, no, one set of rules for all the agencies. And moreover, university, you get the rights, you get the first rights. That's settled. We don't have to negotiate that each time. Great.
All right. But I'm going to interrupt you.
Sure.
I'm not a patent lawyer, and
Sure.
I'm not a medical researcher. Let me back this up and get to a more fundamental question that a lot of people may be wondering about, which is, do I even want this information? Do I really want in my medical records some data that I might be genetically predisposed to cancer or heart disease or whatever it is? I know that about a year ago, the Congress passed the GINA, which was the new Federal Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, which was a historic piece of legislation, which is supposed to protect me from that. But I think I would still think twice about whether I want to have that test. Do I want my insurance company having that? Do I want my employer having that? Where do we stand on all of that?
So let me just finish my brain thing, though. Before I go to that, I will pick that up, and thank you for pushing us back in that direction. What I was going to say about the Bayh-Dole statute, one of the things that they didn't think about when they passed that statute is creating an information base so that people could continually do a better job of figuring out what works and what doesn't work.
Right.
Almost all that stuff goes on behind closed doors. Licenses are secret between a university and their licensee. So when I was saying it matters how you use the patents are public, but as soon as you've got a patent, how you license it, how you use it, is really what matters, and there's no information
Right. So
about
let me ask
that.
my question again. I've got this test here. It can test me for a certain kind of cancer. Do I want to get that test? Is it in my interest to do that?
So that comes down to what's the value of that test for you. And I think we haven't talked about it, but we did a bunch of research for a federal advisory committee that is looking at precisely this question. And its report's going to come out very soon, the next few weeks. And it's looking at what has been the impact of patenting and licensing on clinical access to these genetic tests. So we didn't just look at breast cancer. We looked at breast cancer plus 9 other clinical conditions. And we did most of this work in 2007, 2008. The bill you just talked about, this law about discrimination, didn't pass until May of 2008, and it's only going into effect right now.
But I want to keep you on the question I'm asking, which is,
so that's right.
Would you take that test?
Well, no, I haven't. So have I had my genome scanned and stuff like that? No, I haven't, because I haven't had any reason to do so.
Right.
But if I were in one of these families where several women or maybe one guy has had breast cancer, and I knew I was at risk, I'm pretty sure I would get tested, because I would have an immediate decision to make about when and whether to have my breasts removed and my ovaries removed to reduce the risk of getting breast cancer.
Right.
And these are early onset cancers in these families. So in that context, the value of that information is quite high, because you go from normal risk, 8 or 9%, to suddenly 80%. That's a tenfold difference. That's a pretty big deal.
Right. So you could imagine a situation in which your daughter or someone else, and we're talking about breast cancer, but a number of other diseases. It could be you or me or anyone watching us now. And what I'm hearing you say is there actually is potentially value, and they might want to go ahead and get those tests.
If you're going to make a decision that's about your own life, your own body, I think the information is sometimes quite valuable. That is a very unusual situation, though. We should be clear about that.
And are they now protected? Can their insurance company use that against them?
Well, until a couple of weeks ago, right? Pre-existing conditions, yes, in fact, they could use it against you. And once you have had breast cancer, or if someone knows that you've been tested positive for one of these mutations, the fact is, yes, you can be denied access to health insurance.
Right.
Now, health reform should take care of that. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act that's going into effect right now says, in the context of health insurance and employment, not okay to discriminate. But let me tout a little bit of our own research here from Duke again. One of the master's students from the Sanford School a few years ago was looking for a master's project.
That's our public policy school here.
Our public policy school here. Did a study that was looking at people getting tested for Alzheimer's disease. Duke is the place where the risk of Alzheimer's disease was discovered in association with
and briefly, what did the study find?
What we found is that people who tested high risk for Alzheimer's disease said they were changing their proclivity to get their likelihood of going out and getting long-term care insurance.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? That means that there is a test in the world that tells you whether you're at high risk or low risk, and you're in an insurance market that's private and voluntary, so you can go out and buy insurance or not buy insurance. Well, what's the next move? Well, the insurance companies in that market read our paper, and they're saying, oh my gosh, now we have to ask people if they've been tested for this protein to see if they're at high risk or low risk, and if they're at high risk, we're going to charge them more money, or we're going to price it for everybody, assuming they're at high risk, because if they aren't, then we're going to go out of business, because all these people who know they're at high risk are going to be buying insurance, and the other people aren't going to go out and buy insurance at all because they aren't at high risk. They don't have the incentive to do it. So that the technology, the genetic discovery, creates a new policy dilemma.
Right.
And it's not covered by the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act.
Right. Let me just tell you that we have 250 viewers, and we invite all of you to send in your question for Professor Cook-Deegan. You can do that in 3 ways. You can email live@duke.edu, post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page, or tweet with the tag Duke Live. Professor Cook-Deegan, how did you get interested in this? We've been talking now about law and about policy and legal rulings and scientific studies, but you were trained as a physician. How did you end up doing this personally?
So David, I was in medical school my freshman year, and I was actually writing my applications to go to law school because I hated medical school that first year. And I got a call my last quarter of my first year of medical school from my girlfriend in New York, and she said my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And that changed my life because I decided I was going to do research on Alzheimer's disease. And the kind of research that we did, this was 1976. There was no Human Genome Project. In fact, we didn't even have the idea of having a map of the human chromosomes. That didn't happen until 1980, believe it or not. But we did know that there were these rare families where it looked like there was a broken gene that if we looked hard enough, we'd be able to find it.
Yeah.
So we started looking for families that had an inherited form of Alzheimer's disease. And it took 19 years. But in the families that we worked on, they did eventually find a chromosomal location on chromosome 1 and a mutation that was associated with high risk in those families.
Right. And so I'm
that's
guessing
what got me into it.
You got hooked not just on treating an individual patient at the bedside, but on the much broader questions of public health and public policy and what do we do as a nation to deal with things in a much broader way.
Yeah, and it was Alzheimer's disease at a time when Alzheimer's disease was not a national cause célèbre. Nobody had ever heard of it when I was in medical school.
Well,
so I lived through a period when Alzheimer's disease became a household word, when the advocacy organizations began to organize and get Congress to pay attention to this devastating disease in a way that they never had. And I happened to be at the Office of Technology Assessment working for Congress at a time that movement actually caught traction, so I got to watch that at very close range. And you see the effect that congressional policy, that our laws, our democracy actually sometimes works and changes the world.
Well, I can feel the passion in your voice. So if I was, and you teach undergraduates and others at Duke, but if I'm watching from anywhere, if I'm a student and I was interested in going into science policy, what advice would you have for them?
The advice I give my students is to get really well trained in a technical discipline or in something that you care immensely about, and keep your eye on the horizon at the same time. But you are most useful to the world if you really know what you're talking about and you bring a set of skills into the arena of policy that is grounded in critical thought and knowledge. But then also don't forget that there are people in the world, and it's the things that they care about that actually matter for policy.
Right.
So you can't just be a techie or a nerd.
Right.
But it's good to be a caring nerd, right?
And you've combined this with the passion for human rights as well, both and global health and other kinds of broader issues.
Yeah, and I can't say that I've really combined it so much as I've done them at different times in my career. Mary Claire King has done a better job of completely integrating human rights with her research. She's one of the heroines of this breast cancer story. She is the one who found the location on the human chromosomes where these genes were located.
Right.
At the same time, she was also using the miraculous techniques of DNA analysis to study human rights problems in Argentina after the dirty war there. So an amazing human story there.
Right, which just shows the power of genetics beyond, we were talking about
in ways that we never even thought about.
1980s and how much things have changed then. So I want to ask you one more question before we close, and it's a fairly general question, which is, one way or another, this case is going to sort out, and the patent system will sort out, for better or for worse. Look ahead 10 years, 20 years, when gene testing presumably will be much more common. We're moving more towards personalized medicine. So when your kids or my kids are our age, and they go to the doctor, how will things be different for them? Once we sort out all of these very complex legal questions and policy questions, where are we heading with this genomic medicine stuff?
So I think where we are right now is there are two things going on in the world simultaneously that are kind of incompatible, and we're going to have to sort that out. One is genes are a super big deal. There's too much hype, and everybody's thinking genomics is the solution to everything bad in the world. That's not true. It's not even all that medically significant yet. That's part A. Part B is it's getting so ridiculously cheap to use these technologies that I will be shocked, utterly shocked, if in 5 years there aren't a lot of people beginning to get full genome sequence analysis when they go to the hospital. There are companies that are saying we're going to have instruments on the market for $50,000 that you can do a genome in less than a day, right? And I believe that that's true. So what does that mean for our culture? I think it means there are going to be a whole lot of people who aren't going to go to their doctor to get their full genome done. They're going to already have that on their computer at home when they walk in the door.
Yeah.
And the question's going to be, how do they continually change how they interpret that? But I think the generation that's now in kindergarten and elementary school is going to grow up in a world where it's kind of just understood that information about your genome is part of your life. And it's understood as something that you think about sometimes, but you may leave it in the closet most of the time and pull it out only when it's relevant for a particular decision, but it's going to be there.
Right.
And right now it isn't. So I think that's going to be a change. And I think it's not because of how important the information is, it's because how cheap the technology is going to be. And the information matters a little bit at the margin for a lot of decisions
Right.
that people make in their lives.
So many more changes to come, and all the more reason we're going to have you back here on
Yeah.
office hours
Thank you,
to talk about what comes up in the future. So, Professor Cook-Deegan, thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining us here on
That was fun.
Online Office Hours. And to learn more about Professor Cook-Deegan's work, visit the Duke Institute for Genome Sciences and Policy. Their website is at genome.duke.edu. A recording of this office hours session, along with many other Duke videos, will be available on the new Duke On Demand website at ondemand.duke.edu. Next week on Office Hours, Professor Ellen Davis talks about Christians and creation. And to learn more about Duke, visit duke.edu.